I was like researching this stuff about Saint Basil, and I'm like, you're kind of like a commie bro.
Bro.
Hey everybody, it's your boy, the Nerdy Christian, aka Christopher Haylett, joined by my friend,
Alex Acevedo, what's up?
aka Creative Alex,
Yes.
if you want to follow him on the gram. And here on the Nerdy Christian, we talk about all things church history, theology, philosophy, popular media, and the fun interplays of all of those things. So today, we're going to talk about Saint Basil of Caesarea, not the Caesarea in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually in Turkey.
Oh, I thought Basil, like you were gonna like spice it up.
Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Basil too.
Okay, that's cool.
Man,
that's a cool name.
Yeah.
If I had got another dog, I'd name him Basil.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. Let's keep moving.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about a take that he has on a popular Bible passage that you've probably heard before, but more than likely you heard it from the perspective of Saint Clement and kind of what's become the mainline perspective. So Saint Clement of Alexandria, around 300s AD, he proposed the same interpretation that we hold today on the story of the rich young ruler. So Matthew 19 and Mark 10, you have this guy, he goes to Jesus, he says, hey, what do I got to do to be saved? And Jesus says, follow the commandments. He says, well, I've followed them. And in Matthew, he says, which ones? And in Mark, he says, I have followed them. And then Jesus says, okay, well, now go sell all you have to the poor and follow me. And this guy's real rich. And he goes, that sucks. Never mind. And he goes away sad.
I'll pass.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you've heard this story before,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
yes.
So like what? Probably, I mean, maybe you don't even have the main line. Maybe you're just ages ahead of all of us. But what's your perspective on like the takeaway of this?
I think a lot of us sometimes just feel very challenged. We have what is it, like this fear of resource, and so I think like when we do have things,
Fear of lack.
letting them go is challenging. And so I think he made the point that not just if you're rich, I mean, and even now us in living in America, like you can be poor and still be rich compared to the rest of the world. So I think this is a challenge that is, he knew then that is going to hold true forever. That is a daily challenge for us to work through.
I think a lot of Christians even would react very similar to how he did, and that they'd be like, because we have a very efficiency minded view and like good stewardship minded view of capital, which has, you know, its place, but also I feel like they'd be like, Jesus, that is a horrible use of money. Like if Jesus is like, hey, just go give all you have, all your money to the homeless and follow me. So many people be like, they're going to use it on drugs, or, you know, like, let's be real.
Yeah.
They're just gonna, there's a lot of people who'd just be like, oh, that's not the most efficient use of my capital. I'm not doing that. I can help the poor, but not like that.
And people do that sometimes even with like churches, or like they always want to know like, okay, well, I'm going to tithe, or I'm going to do like, what are you going to do with it? You know? Yeah,
exactly. And I feel like there is something to the simplicity of what he's calling him to. St. Clement proposes that Jesus's test here, or what this is an individual test by Jesus of the rich young ruler, to test his heart, to reveal that this is an idol in his life, and that he can't, as the Bible says, you can't have two masters. You can't love God and money, right?
Yeah.
That's the traditional view. St. Basil takes a different approach, which is really interesting. He says, in response to the young man, and in his homily to the rich, and in response to anyone who would respond similarly, he says, it is thus evident that you are far from fulfilling the commandment. So he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. He says you're not fulfilling that commandment, and that you bear false witness within your own soul that you have loved your neighbor as yourself. Look, the Lord's offer shows just how distant you are from true love. For if what you say is true, that you have kept from your youth the commandment of love and have given to everyone the same as to yourself, then how did you come by this abundance of wealth? Care for the needy requires the expenditure of wealth when all share alike, dispersing their possessions among themselves. They each receive a small portion for their individual needs. Thus, those who love their neighbor as themselves possess nothing more than their neighbor. And that's like, whoa, okay. Like there's a whole new can of worms with this. I was like researching this stuff about St. Basil, and I'm like, you're kind of like a commie bro. Bro. Like he would be a Bernie bro. He would be a Bernie bro. He 100% would be. Like some of the things that he says, I'm like, I like understand where you're coming from, and I understand the case, and I agree to some extent. But then also he's like, hey, none of you guys should have anything more than anyone else. And I'm like, well, there is like, I come from an economics background. I'm like, there is a certain necessity of incentives and,
no, yeah.
Stuff like that.
I mean, it's sometimes I think it depends on the season too. Sometimes it makes it's very easy. It's like, oh, if everyone has the same, then there's no problems. Like it's fair and all that. But it continues to always be a hard issue. Like we all deal with the greed. So even if, let's say, someone gives us, half of what they have, and that greed peaks in, and you want more. Or what's that other story with the guy that the master like forgave the guy, but then he wouldn't forgive the other person. So I think it's that wrestling that with our flesh that we just constantly have, no matter what the layer is. There's always going to be some type of challenge.
And he, to his credit, he lived this out himself. He was born into a family of nobility. Like his family was a bunch of rock stars of the faith. He had there are 5 named saints in his immediate family, and like all of them are like, we're gonna dedicate our whole lives to Jesus. And he was born into this noble family and ended up deciding, you know what, like if I was granted this, I was granted it to specifically for the purpose of service. And that's something he talks about a lot, is stewardship. But not in the way, I feel like we use stewardship as an excuse sometimes in the West. Like, well, I need to steward this money wisely. And that means not just giving it away, but it's like, yeah, maybe that's like a part of stewardship. He says, it befits those who possess sound judgment to recognize that they have received wealth as a stewardship and not for their own enjoyment. Thus, when they are parted from it, they rejoice as those who relinquish what is not really theirs, instead of becoming downcast like those who are stripped of their own. Or in his homily, I will tear down my barns, he says, if you acknowledge that your belongings were given to you by God, then tell me, for what purpose did you receive them? And here he gets into something interesting where he says, like, is it unjust of God? So if we truly believe that everyone who has anything, that's particularly the believer, it is a gift from God. If we truly believe that, then he says, is God unjust when he distributes to us unequally the things that are necessary for life? So like, that's an interesting question. Like, if we do believe that God grants, then why does he grant some more and some others? And he says, he asks this question exactly. Why then are you wealthy while another is poor? Why else but so that you might receive the reward of benevolence and faithful stewardship, while the poor are honored for patient endurance in their struggles. But you, stuffing everything into the bottomless pockets of your greed, assume that you wrong no one, yet how many in fact do you dispossess? And he says basically, like, God granted that to you specifically so that you could express holiness in the re-granting of it.
I mean, I think about the parable with the talents, right? Where the master gives them to like his workers and how they like use them. But I also wonder if it's just like God, in stitching us together, knew us before we were birthed and knew what our gifts were going to be, what our challenges was going to be. Like, is it also just that possible there, knowing like, okay, I know you have the potential to steward this well, or I think if I don't give you the funds or the money or the resources, like you will be more in abundance in either joy, encouragement, patience or anything like that. That is it possible that is also God's, strategy, if you will, on not giving everyone the same amount, because we're not all made the same. Like we're made in his image, but we're each like reflect a different aspect of his personality. And so like to each their own, in the sense of like what you're gifted with is different than what I'm gifted with, and so that affects how we um, support,
Yeah.
the mission of what God's called us to do.
That brings up like another thing that he said is he talks about so people passing on, like wanting to have a lot of wealth to pass on to their children.
Yeah.
And he says like he blames parents for leading their children into sin and avarice, because he's like, you taught them, one, wealth is the chief pursuit, but then two, like if wealth was a temptation for you and you're spending all of your life making sure that your children have all of that wealth, you're passing that same temptation potentially to them. And so I wonder if God sometimes knows, on the flip side of like, this person will steward this well, knows you're not ready yet to experience this. Like look at like there's all sorts of celebrities who have faced this where they just skyrocket, and then it's a rapid rise and a fiery burn, on the crash down as the heights don't live up to maybe what they thought they would. So I feel like there's something to that too. Maybe.
I mean, it always looks good from a distance, and then when you're in it, the challenges that come with that responsibility are difficult.
Mm-hmm. He said something. My favorite quote from his homily is, "Indeed, those who love gold do not mind being bound with manacles so long as their chains are of gold." And I think this is so relevant to our modern consumer culture.
Yeah.
Where it's you like get enslaved to like getting the next thing, buying the next car, having the bigger house, like everything. There's always a next thing that kind of can bind us in our lives, but we don't mind as long as it is the nicer car, the bigger house, whatever it is. That's those monocles of.
It's like I'm in prison, but hey, I got
it's real nice.
It's like life's, and you hear it too sometimes. Like I remember growing up, or when I grow up, like in my 20s, it was the hustle culture, right? Like everyone's hustling. And so everyone's like complaining about working really hard because, they got their job, they got their side thing and all this stuff. But then they could do all the things, but it's just a lot of work. And I mean, you could argue inflation and how everything's going on, but at the same time, I don't think we were designed our minds to be focused on so many things, and just be in that chaos of trying to have and have through these different aspects.
There's something super beautiful about just contentment. Like contentment is the key, and if you don't reach contentment before you pursue increase, then you won't be content when you increase.
Yeah, no, that's a fact. I mean, even in a creative aspect, like there's so many possibilities on how you can make something. Here we are creating, this podcast, and there's always going to be new tools, new, styles. And I mean, I think I'm in a season now that I'm trying to figure out how to be boring to a sense. And boring, I mean, to me, because my mind will always want to be like stimulated by the next thing.
Being okay with the mundane.
Yeah.
The everyday.
Yeah. And if I can be okay with it, then I can be better, at the one thing versus trying to be excited by the possibility of being able to do multiple things.
Yeah. And that makes me think, like, I think the real crux of what St. Basil is getting at here, and this is almost 2,000 years ago. It's like 1,700 years ago that he wrote this. The real crux of it, I think, is instead of saying, I'm going to make X amount of money, and of that, I'm going to give X amount to God, which I think we oftentimes in evangelical culture highlight with the tithe. Like, if you check that box, you're good.
Yep.
Whereas Basil would be like, it's not about how much you give, it's about how much you keep. And it's a massive inversion that is, I think, should be at the heart of Christian generosity.
Yeah.
Is you say, this is how much I need for sustenance and for this X quality of life. And that I feel like we don't oftentimes speak to the actual reality of it's a balance. This should not be an easy like calculation formula.
Yeah.
It should be God, what do I need? What's your calling to me?
I've come to learn that balance is not real.
Yeah.
But I've come to understand that it is a tension. And so what is the tension you are able to bear? Because even if we talk about balancing beams and stuff like that, there's a tension that creates that balance. But tension never feels good, you know. And so how do we find comfort in the tension to have balance?
Yeah, and I feel like we can only navigate that interplay if we have these core principles that he speaks to. Like he says, you claim that you are this is so, he speaks so precisely to 21st century consumer culture, despite living in what is now modern day Turkey, but living in Asia Minor in 300s AD. Like he says, you claim that you yourself are a pauper, and I concur. Like he's like, you say you're broke. Yeah, I agree. But now a pauper is someone who lacks many things. You lack many things, and the insatiability of your desire makes you lack many things indeed, is what he says. Like, sure, there's a lot of things that you lack, because you always want all of these things that you lack.
Yeah.
So yeah, anybody can point to a bunch of things that they lack, basically, is what he says. And then he says, yet this constant accumulation does not quell the craving, but only further inflames your appetite. I was like, ooh.
Yeah, if you have a little, like, you give baby like a taste of something good, you know, then you build that tolerance, and you want more and more of it. Yeah.
My second favorite quote from him was, tell me, what benefit do you acquire by waving your hand about resplendent with gems? He says, should you not rather blush for shame? This is a boss line. Should you not rather blush for shame, having the strange desire for pebbles like the cravings of pregnant women?
What? Okay.
He's like you desire these rocks like a woman desires. I mean, today maybe you'd say pickles or ice cream, like pregnancy cravings.
Okay. I'm like,
like that to me, just comparing the desire for like unreasonable wealth, or not even unreasonable, like just wasteful fashion.
Yeah,
I guess to like pregnancy cravings.
Like, do you really need those Jordans?
Makes me chuckle.
You know.
yeah. Preachers and sneakers. Show what's up. Yeah. All right. One other thing that he said that I mean, there's so many things. I would encourage you guys to go read Saint Basil. Read his homilies, To the Rich, I Will Tear Down My Barns, and In Time of Famine and Drought. They're really great. But one thing he talks about that is also so relevant to our culture today is he talks about posthumous gifts. So gifts after our death, right? And he says, no one can perform good works after the conclusion of this life. He talks about, like, you're basically like trying to postpone the weight of morality until after you're dead, when it doesn't matter for your soul really, like, anymore. He says, your intent is evil. While I am alive, I will revel in self-indulgence, but when I die, then I will begin practicing the commandments. And he says, if he's just like, he has so many mic drops. If you were immortal, you would never have remembered the commandments. And I think that's so good for like a lot of, I'm not trying to bash on like Gen X and boomers right now, but I do know a lot. Like, I work in the development space, and a lot talk about like, oh, well, yeah, I'll set this up so that when I pass, all of this wealth will be distributed.
Yeah.
And that thing of, if you were immortal, you would never have remembered the commandments. I'm like, ooh, that's a burn.
Who's that? There's like some rich guy who's like trying to de-age. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, that's like big in Silicon Valley right now.
Yeah.
Like, what's the key to extending what are they? The telomeres, I think.
I don't know. It just sounds crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, life as long as it is, you want to make more of it, and it's like, anyway.
Yeah. He says works of piety are an excellent burial garment. Yeah. One critique I will say of him is he said he does seem very, for lack of a better term, just Catholic in terms of his focus on works as relevant to salvation. He says in a few spots, like he says, you showed no mercy, it will not be shown to you. You opened not your house, you will be expelled from the kingdom. You gave not your bread, you will not receive eternal life. And I think it's worth us acknowledging the question that's asked there, because we do have the example of the sheep and the goats, right? Where Jesus is like, hey, you didn't clothe me, you didn't visit me in prison. Like, when didn't we visit you? Whenever you didn't do one to those things. So what do you feel about that balance there of like works-based salvation, like he kind of pushes towards a little bit. Like he even told the rich, like basically, he's like, if you guys want to go to heaven, you need to be more generous.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, Basil, that's not the theology I would entirely agree with, but
Yeah.
I get your heart. But
I think that goes for a lot of things. I mean, we always have to keep things in check.
yeah,
And I think that is why it's valuable to be in a community where you have, the CEO in a small group with, a bus driver or something of that sense, to keep perspective
mm-hmm.
in check, to understand each other's hearts, to like, it's valuable. I mean, I think sometimes we can recommend, like, okay, if you want to like be successful, be around successful people, and there's truth in that, for mentorship, coaching,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, we always have to keep things into perspective and understanding that this is not the only world. Like sometimes you can be
Yes.
in that space and only see that the same thing, where it's like, well, if you don't do any of these things, then you're not saved. But what's to say that they're not making different types of moves
Mm-hmm.
that is still, because they have abundance, they can do things. And so sometimes it's easy to point the fingers and say, well, I'm at the non-for-profits, I'm volunteering here, I'm doing all that sting,
Mm-hmm.
and and so then, are you doing those works so people see them, or are you doing because of their purity of your heart?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's also, I mean, the same thing with giving, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
give a cheerful giver. Like, where's your heart?
Yeah.
And so, we say that sometimes you can be generous with your time, your talents, and your treasures. So, and I think for any of those, it's still true. Like, what is your heart posture as you're doing those things?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
you don't even then like be suffering while you're serving,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like, I got to do this or I got to do that. Then don't do it if you don't
Yeah.
want to do it.
Yeah.
Like, unless you've been convicted, like, oh, okay, I'm doing this because I want to love my neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in kind of summary, what St. Basil would want us to draw from this is then the story of the rich young ruler, like, comes down to, do you really love your neighbor as yourself? The question that we then ask then maybe is, who is our neighbor? And also, yeah, am I loving them truly as myself? And what do I have to do to orient my life so that I can to orient my perspective on in terms of like my understanding of my needs, to in the famine, like in his thing where he talks on famine, he talks about, like, if you truly believe that God loves not loves, is in charge of everything, and someone comes to your door asking for food, and you have one piece of bread left, if you have true biblical faith, you will share that bread with them.
Yeah.
Because and if you love your neighbor as yourself, because one, they're your neighbor, there you go, and two, God can provide. And I think this is an interesting and valuable challenge for all of us who, whether we're wealthy or middle class, or even in our context, poor, to consider is loving my neighbor as myself. Like, do those around me thrive to the same degree I do, even if I'm barely thriving more than them?
Yeah.
Like, even if I have one piece of bread left and they have none, like, that is an interesting interplay. But then I guess the question I would ask you, and that I would posit to anyone watching, is, in this modern age, who's our neighbor? Because that's that's the tough interplay, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's the person next to you, we always say, right?
Mm-hmm,
And I
mm-hmm,
think, I mean, I can be challenged. I mean, in the community I live in, like, I know some of my neighbors. I don't talk to all of them. Like,
mm-hmm.
I don't keep in touch. But I think that's also just a, is it a byproduct of just the American life, or just the suburban life that's been created, in this space where we don't really lean into the people in our community as much as we used to, or we have in other
Mm-hmm.
spaces, because then we almost choose our communities, right? So is your neighbor your
Yeah.
people at work? Is your neighbor just your people at your church? But then you really don't kind of connect with your community where you
Yeah.
live, or other spaces. But I think to the simplest form, it's really like, if my neighbor needed something, then, and I can help or give or do something, then I'm gonna do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to downcast anyone at any time.
Yeah.
To be like, well, that's what you did to yourself.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, So if I have something, challenging myself, okay, what can I do?
Yeah.
As small or as big as it is. Like if it's the smallest intention, they just needed help because they messed up their leg, and maybe I can help them walk down, their trash. Or, their car broke down and need a ride, or anything like that. Or maybe they need money or some kind of funds. Like there's actual giving or a dinner or something like that. Like, what can I do and let it be genuine out of my heart, so that in response, they could see Christ through me.
Yeah, I have had needs met when I was unable to meet them by other Christians, and Chris and I have been blessed to have the opportunity to similarly meet needs at points in our life. And I think it is tough to say, like, well, is our neighbor like everyone in the world? Because we have access to everyone in the world today. But I think the easy spot to start is, I can't tell you where your neighbor, where it ends, like of who is your neighbor, but I can tell you where it starts.
Yeah.
Like, and I think maybe in our churches, we could do a better job of understanding this kind of, I feel like we should have an unspoken promise of reciprocal care, of like, if we are loving our neighbors as ourselves, then at least everyone in our church is our neighbor.
Yeah.
And that should come kind of with a promise of, like, if anyone in here is struggling to pay rent, and anyone in here has house, like, no one should be going homeless if they're a member of a church, as long as people in that church have homes.
Yeah.
Or no one should be going hungry as long as they're a member of that church, as long as people in that church have food, right? And so I feel like that's something maybe our churches in the U.S. could start as like a nice baseline is, and we have a lot of times external ministries, which is great, but just having this kind of promise of mutual care of, like, as long as anyone has X baseline, you will have X baseline.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. Well, cool, guys. I feel like we had a good conversation here about St. Basil. I hope you drew something from this conversation. Stay tuned for the next video. We're going to talk about nerdy media. We're going to take a scene from Helms Deep and apply key modern relevant spiritual truths from it. Actually, really relevant to, I would say, the time we're in with certain international conflicts and stuff. Just a relevant word from Aragorn and Theoden.
Is there no other way?
I've never watched Lord of the Rings in its entirety. I've seen it in bite sizes.
We can bring you to the nerdy side gradually.
All right.
Wait, I guess we need a nerd and a, like,
It's attention.
an apprentice nerd.
Okay. Attention. You just keep checking.
Yeah.
That's it.
We'll get you there.
All right.
Have a good day, everybody.